Thank you very much. I would like to start to thank you, all the organizer, for the opportunity of being here and share my views with all of you. And what I'm going to talk about under many aspects has been already covered by previous people who spoke today. And also, I will start from the idea that we have to try to see the elephant in the room and how the elephant is relevant. And so my starting point is to consider that cyber war is no longer based only on physical violence, but on military, political, economic, and ideological strategies, exploiting a state or even non-state informational resources. And it is mainly a war about information throughout the information. So maybe we can speak about information war instead of cyber war. The problem are not definition, but the concept underlying the definition. And so understanding cyber war requires us to adopt an informational approach which may try to account for at least a twofold dimension of cyber war, which is connected with destruction and exploitation, and the rethinking, the revision of the notion of violence, and the possible application of the traditional ideas of just war to the scenario of cyber warfare. I think that the theoretical, philosophical roots of war can be traced back to the idea of action, conceived as the capacity of an entity to affect another entity by destroying or modifying it. So a war action has a twofold dimension, being an act of destruction, which damages, deteriorates, delays, or suppresses an entity, which are accustomed to, but also being an act of exploitation, which alters, modifies, distorts an entity in order to obtain something more or different from it, compared to what this entity is normally designed for. So it is interesting to see that already some traditional concept of cyber attack, I just mentioned one from the last, since 12 years old or something more recent, but Professor Pagallo showed another concept of cyber war. And we can recognize from this concept that the concept, instead of cyber attack, is slightly changing from year to year in order to capture all the reality that is encompassed by what we can do through information and through a cyber attack. So we can recognize that there is a difficulty in understanding how to analyze the concept of cyber attack by using traditional concept like that of force when we apply this in cyber warfare. There are, for instance, four criteria that are used to define a cyber attack as a prohibited use of force: the method of delivery, the strict liability model, the direct result model, the consequence-based model. But all of these criteria, they prove to be to some extent, insufficient to account for what is a cyber attack. For very different reasons, the method of delivery is insufficient because cyber weapons might be updated by the time the prohibition is codified. The strict reference to critical infrastructure may collapse the distinction between armed violence, coercion, and mere interference. Or the direct effects of cyber attack can result in non-physical damages, whereas the indirect effects of cyber attack will result in physical damages, and so on. So maybe we need to have a different approach to try to encompass all these different phenomena. And precisely, we have to try to account for the twofold dimension of a cyber attack, because traditional concept of cyber attack do not explicitly account for the twofold dimension of a cyber attack. Destruction, that is to say damaging, deletion, deterioration, alteration, or suppression of informational resources, but also exploitation. Exploitation of informational resources that may lead to disruptive effects. Some can speak of cyber intrusion, which would encompass cyber attacks and cyber exploitation, but maybe what we need is an informational approach that gives us a unified theory encompassing the twofold dimension of a cyber attack. And I will make reference from some other point of view compared to what has already been done today to the informational approach which has proposed throughout the recent years by Luciano Floridi, by taking into account both his philosophy of information and his ethics of information. Just few notions to share a common conceptual ground. Any entity can be defined as an informational object. That is to say, an instance of being made by a bundle of properties constituted by its own information. That is to say, it is a packet of information, which already means that information are not only news or semantic content, is much more than this. Some informational objects are agents, that is to say, entities capable of producing information phenomena that can affect the infosphere. That is to say, they are source of information. Some agents are also moral agents, when they can avail themselves of some information as a resource, to generate some other information as a product, and in so doing, affect their information environment, information as a target. This is the model that this morning Professor Floridi has summarized by speaking of infosphere and high environmentalism. So, if we try to make an informational representation of a cyber attack, this approach gives us the possibility to take into account the twofold dimension of a cyber attack. A cyber attack cites an entity as a source of information. In what sense? It can deprive an entity of its capacity to be a source of information because it damages, deteriorates, delays, or suppresses it. In this case, it is a destructive activity which patently rises to the level of warfare. It destroys an entity as a source of information. It means it destroys this entity as a packet of information. But on the other hand, it can also deprive an entity of its capacity to be a specific source of information. That specific source of information it would have been if not under attack, because it alters, modifies, or distorts the way this entity is a source of information or the information displayed by this entity. Because, for instance, it turns information into misinformation or disinformation, in the sense that Floridi gives to these two concepts. In this case, a cyber attack is not a destructive activity as such, but it can lead to disruptive effects, exploitation, that may rise to the level of warfare. So, the consequence-based model may be coupled with an informational approach. So, I would like to come back to the idea, to the general idea from a philosophical perspective. Maybe the notion of war should be revised because cyber war does not only change the concept of war from some empirical or in the size dimension, but deeply from a philosophical point of view. And so it changes both practically and theoretically. Practically, we have already seen this. Cyber war is no longer necessarily based on state actors, on conventional military instruments, on physical damage, on direct effect, and strictly armed use of force. But also theoretically, because cyber war is no longer necessarily understood in the conventional framework of death, time, peace, and violence. And I would like to concentrate on this framework from a philosophical point of view. Let's take, for instance, death. Traditional war is the sovereign state's claim addressed to its member to be ready to sacrifice their life. Let's take Rousseau, for instance. When the prince says to him, it is expedient for the state that you should die, he ought to die. Whether war no longer involves, at least on one side, human combatants, its legitimation ceases to be based on the democratic process of deliberation, but it is entrusted to national governmental agencies. Furthermore, war is no longer considered and evaluated in relation to the primary value and cost of human life, but becomes matter of technological, economical, and so on, cost and opportunity of resource distribution. So we have already a very big, deep difference between the traditional idea of war. Let's take the framework of time. Here is the important definition of Hobbes of war. Hobbes tells us, war consists not in battle only, or the act of fighting, but in a tract of time, wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known, and therefore the notion of time is to be considered in the nature of war. So, 5 centuries ago, Hobbes already tells us that war is not only battle. that war is not only an act of fighting, but a tract of time, and that time has to be considered in the nature of war. Many cyber attacks cannot simply be announced. In this scenario, it is hard to state in legal terms when a cyber war starts, and so to attribute responsibility for cyber attacks. Cyber war ceases to be a distinguished tract of time to become, possibly and maybe not, an underlying constant stream of more or less covert strategic operation difficult to be traced back to state or non-state actors. Let's take the framework of peace. From Hobbes to Kelsen, peace is understood procedurally and negatively as a mere absence of war, that is, the absence of the legitimate use of physical force. This idea of peace seems to be inconsistent with cyber war, which does not require necessarily the use of force in the traditional sense. Let's take another concept of peace. According to Bobbio, peace is understood procedurally but positively as the legally sanctioned end of a war. Also, this idea of peace is hardly reconcilable with cyber war, which is not necessarily a legally sanctioned beginning and end. At least compared to this concept of peace, cyber war seems not correlative to any concept of peace, which means that we do not only have to revise the notion of war, maybe we have also to revise the notion of peace. And then we can come to for me, the most interesting point, which is the notion of violence, as someone from the public has already raised the problem before. Violence is a very important concept across the whole modernity. To some extent, violence is involved in the foundation of the political order as a negative condition, from which a civil society is to be immunized in order to flourish as a peaceful, stable, and ordered political community. Violence, historically, is anthropological founded and mainly understood in kinetic terms as physical violence. No doubt that physical violence marks a basic difference between kinetic and cyber attacks. However, and I want to, for a while, to contradict myself, the concept of violence elaborated across modernity is wider and more complex than the mere reference to the physical violence let's suppose. So even if we distinguish today between physical violence and non-physical violence, and we try to draw this distinction as a distinction between modernity and our times, it is already true for modernity, that modernity is not only based on physical violence. Let me distinguish between two forms of violence, concerned with the means and the ends of violence. To some extent, we can consider the means of violence concern how violence is perpetrated, and we can define this as a physical violence, despite of some non-physical ways to be violent. The ends of violence concern what violence is meant to achieve, and we can define this as moral violence, despite of some form of violence that are guided by no end. I don't take moral as anything ethically justified, but as referred to an end not immediately perceivable in the manifestation of violence. And I would like to show some examples. Across modernity, the idea of physical violence has been always coupled with the idea of moral violence, which plays a key, less visible role in the foundation of the political order and in the justification of war. Physical and moral violence function as two normative systems that can be engaged or disengaged in order to serve as a justification for each other. I will take only two examples, Hobbes and Locke. In Hobbes, the impediment of physical violence prevents the occurrence of moral violence. In Locke, the impediment of moral violence prevents the occurrence of physical violence. Let me show this briefly because it would be too long to make an analytical demonstration. But for Hobbes, the impediment of the war of all against all physical violence will prevent the betrayal of pacts, moral violence, which only can assure security. Let's quote Hobbes from the Leviathan. The nature of justice consists in maintaining the valid covenants, moral violence. But the validity of the agreements will not start if not with the constitution of a civil power sufficient to compel men to keep them, physical violence. According to Hobbes, physical violence conceptually underlies moral violence, and the disengagement from physical violence assures the maintenance of pacts, that is to say, moral violence, the prevention of moral violence. Let's take Locke. To Locke, the state of nature is not characterized by the war of all against all, physical violence, by the lack of a common judge to appeal to, moral violence. Let's quote Locke. Want of a common judge with authority puts all men in a state of nature. Force without right upon a man's person make a state of war, both where there is and is not a common judge. According to Locke, moral violence conceptually underlies physical violence. The disengagement from moral violence frees human beings from the threat of physical violence. So we see this is just to make it, to show how physical violence is not the only element that we use to justify a legal order or something else, but it is always coupled with something different. So, as I said, physical, either kinetic or cyber violence, is never justified as such, but only when it is coupled with a moral violence to be avoided. In this sense, the recourse to force or to slate requires at least a moral engagement, or in the vocabulary of the just war tradition, a justa causa, namely a good reason to intervene. So let us consider the possible justification of war according to the just war tradition, and then we will come back to the idea of moral violence in an informational perspective. Also, very quick summaries of the theories of just war. There are at least two traditional theories and explanation of just war: the modern jus gentium and the school of natural law tradition, for which the justification of war resides in the right of self-defense, and the Middle Age tradition, the justification of war in this case, resides in the protection of the weak and or of the oppressed. According to the first tradition, that of jus gentium and school of natural law, for all scholars, self-defense is allowed only against the tangible threat of an imminent danger. It is with Hobbes that self-defense can become preventive. The preventive attitude includes three informational strategies. And here you see, when we have said this morning that we have to see the elephant in the room, it has already been done by Hobbes in the Cive, because Hobbes says that we have to discover the enemy's intents, lessening their powers by slate or force, preventing their suspected evils. This preventive attitude is, according to me, the informational foundation of current and future cyber wars. This is the Hobbesian legacy. A just cyber war is characterized not only by defensive or reactive role, self-defense, but primarily by an active and preventive function, which can become the most important side of cyber war. This preventive attitude is of key importance, since prevention, based on the capacity to anticipate future trends, is not simply directed to restore a broken political international order, but it is rather meant to take part in its imagination and construction. We should maybe exaggerate by asking ourselves, does it mean that cyber war is not a continuation of politics by other means, but part of current politics? The Middle Age tradition. According to this tradition, the justification of war resides in the protection of the weak or the oppressed, and in the punishment of the aggressor for their faults. Concern for someone else's unjust suffering may embrace today the protection of human rights. A just cyber war is directed here to restore a broken international political order based on recognized shared values. This requires to share a list of values, the infringement of which causes unjust suffering. So this is the Middle Age legacy. The Middle Age tradition remarks the importance of the protection of human rights, notably when concerned with non-state actors. This, of course, poses problems. There is a tension between the recognition of universally shared values and the pluralist conception of human rights, and the possible preventive intervention to the defense of the weak or the oppressed raise the risk of anticipated crimes. So, but we have to come back to what I have said before, the use of legitimated force is justified on moral grounds, which are not much concerned with the identification of what is just, but rather with the practical impediment of moral violence. So we have tried to understand what is moral violence in cyber age. Is it infringement of pacts, which state actors should maintain according to a duty of trustful cooperation raised by global interdependence? Is the lack of appeal to a common authority which could assert what are the infringement of human rights that may authorize cyber attacks? Or maybe it is something different. We should take into account the informational nature of cyber war. I will skip this, also this one, and I will come to the informational approach to violence. So, Floridi's informational approach has a universalistic dimension. Therefore, we should ask, what is the essence of violence? What is moral violence from an informational standpoint? What is, in informational terms, a deprivation of human rights that amounts to a serious violation of human dignity justifying the recourse to war? So we have to come back to the question that was raised before. We have been confronted to many concepts of violence. Are we able to understand what is the essence of violence? Whether there is a grounding concept and unified concept of violence. And there are many forms of violence, but they all seem to share a common conceptual ground that defines the essence of violence. And I will make reference to a philosopher which for me can give us a concept, the essence of violence. He says, violence is to be found in any action in which one acts as if one were alone to act, as if the rest of the universe were there only to receive the action. So this definition of violence can apply to any different forms of violence, whether physical, non-physical, psychological, verbal, systematic, structural, and so on. Violence is what turns an agent into a mere patient, or in other terms, what prevents a patient from becoming an agent. Violence is found in any action in which one acts regardless to another member of the universe, whatever be this member of the universe. The essence of violence is its radical regardlessness. And we can apply this to informational moral violence. Violence is what turns an agent into a mere patient, we have said, or what prevents a patient from becoming an agent. That is to say that a patient is deprived by a fundamental capacity to become a specific source of information. We have to recall the definition of informational agent. The violent act deprives an entity to be that source of information it would have been if not subject to violence. For these reasons, an information agent cannot also be a moral agent. From an informational standpoint, moral violence is the deprivation of such fundamental capacity, that is to say, to be that specific source of information. This may apply to the informational basic rights. Informational security rights are part of the socially basic rights justifying a cyber attack. I have skipped this slide, but I have already defined the socially basic rights as the rights that are so fundamental that they afford the exercise of all the other rights. So the key question is whether or not to be that source of information may count as well as a subsistence right. The answer is to be found in the nature of affordance of subsistence rights. A specific source of information has an informational subsistence right when these afford the possibility to exercise all the other rights. In this case, the protection of that source of information may be a legitimate reason for war. Being a specific source of information allows the agent to be what it is as a moral agent, and thus the informational subsistence right tend to coincide also with negative liberty if this one is conceived as a necessary requirement for moral choice and human flourishing. This means that the informational approach not only gives us a unified concept of cyber attack, of moral violence, but also widen the range of subsistence rights by including negative liberty within the social basic rights that authorize the intervention to protect the weak or the oppressed. Thank you.
Okay. So do we have any question or any comment? Plenty. So the gentleman here, and then.
Sir, that was a very interesting and somewhat radical definition. Where does something like the concept of responsibility to protect fall in if we define violence in the fashion you do and the nature of the victims in the manner that you did?
Sorry?
Where does the concept of the responsibility to protect an oppressed or victimized population come into play under your concept of violence?
Because the victim are, for me, they can be an example of a patient which cannot become an agent because it is victimized. And so we are justified and we can have a responsibility to intervene when this process of victimization raised to the level of preventing someone to become an agent in the sense I have already mentioned. And so the responsibility is founded in the recognition of the violence which is perpetrated on these victims, which are patients which cannot become agents.
That's a rather radical concept, and that suggests, I mean, one of the most commonly encountered cyber attacks we see against non-state actors is against dissident populations. I mean, that suggests a basis for action on behalf of dissident populations that has not been broadly contemplated. It's a pretty radical notion.
Yeah, it is, but yeah, I know. But I don't say that all the time it justifies intervention. What I wanted to say it is that maybe we need to widen our concept of what can be the target of a cyber attack in order to encompass a different situation. And this different situation may be unified by an informational approach that takes into consideration not only a target which is a mere object that is destroyed, but also, in some cases, a source of information that is prevented to be that information, that source of information that would have been if not under attack, as a software system or a way to supply water and so on. In this sense, they are not working as they were normally working or they were designed to work for, if not they were under attack. But to widen this definition, maybe capture some different phenomena.
Very interesting, sir.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Sorry, but a few more. Giovanni? That was quite loud.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see if it works now. No, I also was wondering.
Okay, they are interesting, your two examples, but they are different.
Yes, no, I just was wondering how you, and also with regard to information, I think that according to your approach, whenever there is an interference on somebody else's activity that is violent, this is not accepted by the other.
No. In a slide, maybe I was a little quick. I wanted to say that maybe we have to have some criteria as what I mentioned before, but you can take the method of delivery, the strict effect, the direct effect, or the consequence-based model, but maybe you have to couple this approach or to rethink this approach by associating with also an informational approach, to try to understand whether some recognized insufficiency in applying these criteria can be filled with something else. I don't think that that approach can apply to every situation or work out every solution. That's for sure. But maybe it serves us to try to understand a way to rethink or redefine the criteria that are already recognized as insufficient in order to account for all the situations. And to come back to the previous question, of course, that was just a quotation, and maybe we should consider more diffusely the concept of violence in Levinas' moral philosophy. But of course, your two examples, example is an example of violence. If I pollute, regardless to the rest of humanity, I can be judged violent because I don't care of anyone else, just of me, but my action has an effect on the other. If I go to the restaurant regardless to the other, this does not affect all the other.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I think Alessandro? Yeah. So we have one more. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for your presentation. There is a lot of food for thought in there. I have a question and a small provocation.
Yeah.
The question is about the concept of subsistence rights, informational subsistence rights. How does that correlate with, or does that correlate with the rights to privacy? Meaning my information about myself,
yeah,
or information that I want to keep.
Could you switch off the microphone and try to speak a bit louder because it's...
It is. Yeah, of course it is. It is precisely in the sense that if you consider yourself as a packet of information, however this may sound provocative or for someone disturbing, of course your informational decisional power or your informational privacy becomes part of the definition of yourself. And so there could be a subsistence right in the sense that there you are allowed to develop yourself and so to become what you want to become. And keep secret what you want to keep secret, for sure. There is, if I can make a quotation, interesting quotation, Levinas, which you will never think that you would have done this quotation, says that liberalism was the capability to maintain a secret before the collectivity. So, of course, you have to be able to keep a secret before the collectivity.
Your chance to be provocative?
Yeah. No, because, yeah, I don't think so. I think that we do all the time, and that's what we have paid for, to rethink all the concepts. Yeah, no, we're not paid enough, but we are paid for this.
Well said. Thank you. So, Matt, may I ask you the same to speak a bit louder because the microphones seem to be out of order. Or if you prefer, you can also join us here and use one of our microphones.
Okay. I think I've changed my question actually now in relation to the last point, because I was throughout the day I'm having this sort of thought that keeps coming back, which is we keep being told we need to reconceptualize different concepts and war, peace, violence. And the more I keep being told that, the more I'm thinking, well, maybe cyber war is just something else, and the concepts don't apply because they don't apply, because it is just a different thing altogether. And it's not about, therefore, trying to fit something into a sort of box it just doesn't fit into, but maybe coming up with a whole different conceptual apparatus that is better suited to it.
I see your point, but at the same time, I spent in the past quite a long time thinking and studying about this notion of violence, and I can make you sure that just to remain with the last century, you have Walter Benjamin, Hannah Arendt, Georges Sorel, Emmanuel Levinas, all of this rethinking the idea of violence. Maybe because it was necessary. Not just because everybody wants to take part in a useless debate, but because each of them maybe can make us to see something different about a complex phenomenon. Each of them can contribute to, it is not just to substitute one concept with another. Maybe each of them can contribute to make us understand something more about a complex phenomenon. Sometimes some concepts can be at variance with each other, but some other times they are just a contribution to make us to see something from different perspectives and to enrich the comprehension of a phenomenon.
Thank you very much. So we'll allow a few moments. Thank you very much, Massimo.